Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Saturday, September 7th, 2024. This is the Excerpt. Today, Donald Trump's hush money sentencing has been delayed. Plus, Dick Cheney endorses Kamala Harris, and how feds are cracking down on 3D printed gun modifications. Former President Donald Trump's sentencing and his criminal hush money conviction has been pushed back until after the election. Trump was found guilty earlier this year of falsifying business records to cover up hush money payments made on his behalf to adult film actress Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election. I caught up with USA Today Justice Department correspondent Aisha Bagchi for the latest. Aisha, thanks for hopping on.
Thanks, Taylor. I'm happy to be here.
So, Aisha, former President Donald Trump's sentencing in his criminal hush money conviction has been delayed. What do we know here? What was decided on Friday?
Judge Juan Merchan, he is the judge who's been overseeing the case, decided that the sentencing, it was supposed to go forward at this point on September 18th, that it should be pushed back until after the election. This came after multiple delays that have happened already. Donald Trump was found guilty of 34 felony counts on May 30th. And at that time, Judge Merchan scheduled sentencing for July 11th. But in between those two dates, the Supreme Court issued a ruling on presidential immunity. And basically, Trump said, in light of this ruling, you need to delay sentencing because we need to deal with what he said was grounds to toss out the entire conviction. And after that, Judge Merchan decided to delay sentencing and ultimately scheduled it for September 18th, assuming it's still necessary after he rules on the presidential immunity issue. And basically what happened after that is Trump argued that this is really close to the election. It's not appropriate for sentencing to be happening so close to a presidential election. And he also said that he had some arguments about the presidential immunity issue, and he should be able to appeal them if Judge Merchan rules against him before he is sentenced. And ultimately, Judge Merchan decided that this is too close to the election, and he was worried about two things. One is the idea that there would be an appearance in the public that the election was affecting his sentencing decision, whether he sentences Trump to time behind bars, whether he does something else. The options are really open to him. And secondly, that the public might think that the sentencing decision was guided by some desire to influence the election. And he talked about both those things and saying, we just need to take a pause. And now sentencing is scheduled for 3 weeks after Election Day.
Wow. So, Aisha, have we heard from prosecutors or Trump's defense after this delay from the judge?
Yes, a spokesperson for Trump got back to me pretty quickly when we were doing our story on this decision and said the whole case should be dismissed. That's their bottom line. They've said all along, the Trump camp, that this is about election interference. That's how they characterize this prosecution and other prosecutions against Trump. Of course, the Manhattan DA has a response that they investigated the facts and that this really didn't have to do with the election. Alvin Bragg's office responded just kind of reiterating that Donald Trump was convicted and he is ultimately going to be sentenced. So they just wanted to remind, I guess, readers and the public out there that nothing about this decision affects the reality that a unanimous 12-person jury in Manhattan found Donald Trump guilty of 34 felony counts back in May.
Well, the timing is interesting here, Aisha. This news came out just days before the first presidential debate between Trump and Kamala Harris. Does this give the Trump camp kind of a boost coming into this week?
Arguably it does, though really the political debate about how this entire situation affects the election, you saw wide-ranging opinions. Some people thought that if Donald Trump was sentenced, that could help him in the election, that it might motivate some of his supporters or potential supporters to go out to the polls as kind of a protest against the whole idea of his being sentenced. And also, if he wins the election, most legal experts say they don't expect that courts would say that you can put someone behind bars, either if they're the elected soon-to-be president or if they're actually president. There are all sorts of arguments about how this would have affected the election. Yes, he's really happy about it. In that sense, it gives him a boost, probably personally. He did not want to experience being sentenced. But what it means politically is complicated. There are some people out there who thought that if Trump was sentenced to time behind bars, but that sentence wasn't imposed immediately, that could also create some concerns around the election, that if Donald Trump lost, he might have an extra incentive to question those results because if he doesn't win, that could mean that that time behind bars was looming. So it is a bit complicated about how this decision affects the election. It probably will. It's probably just above my pay grade to understand exactly how.
And Aisha, in terms of what's next here, is this just a matter of counting down the days until that November date, or should we be looking out for other dates on the calendar over the next couple of months?
Yes, there's still things to come. I mean, Trump has this pending motion to toss out the entire guilty verdict. So we still are awaiting a decision on that. Judge Merchan was expected to issue that decision September 16th, but he actually pushed that date back as well. He pushed it until after the election also, until November 12th. That's a big one. And then it is also a question of seeing what the sentencing recommendations are. Trump's team almost surely is going to say that he shouldn't be sentenced to any time behind bars. The prosecution really has this open question about what it's going to recommend. And we don't know if that document, that recommendation to the judge will become public. But if it does, that could be very telling about what Judge Merchan thinks of doing. I mean, in this case, with the sentencing delay, Judge Merchan said in his decision that the prosecution didn't oppose this delay, and that seemed to weigh in his decision that, okay, let's go ahead and let this date be pushed back until after the election. That'll be something to really be watching for.
All right, brilliant insight as always. Aisha Bagchi covers the Justice Department for USA Today. Thank you, Aisha.
Thank you, Taylor.
As for the election, Donald Trump won't be helped by the endorsements of Vice President Kamala Harris from stalwart Republicans, like, as of yesterday, former Vice President Dick Cheney. He joined his daughter, former Representative Liz Cheney, in endorsing the Democratic nominee. In a statement yesterday, Dick Cheney said, quote, "In our nation's 248-year history, there has never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump," unquote. Last month, 238 Republicans who previously worked for President George W. Bush, the late Senator John McCain, or Senator Mitt Romney pledged their support to the Democratic nominee in an open letter. Russia is ramping up its election interference efforts as Election Day nears, working specifically to help Donald Trump defeat Kamala Harris using more sophisticated techniques, including unwitting and even witting Americans, and trying to affect down-ballot elections as well. That's what U.S. intelligence officials said yesterday in a 75-minute briefing with reporters. The officials, speaking on background to discuss classified matters, said they could not comment on specifics, including which Americans, if any, might be under criminal investigation or what constitutes the kind of witting accomplices the Kremlin is using to help the former president defeat Vice President Harris. The briefing marked one of the first times, if not the first, that U.S. intelligence officials have explicitly said Russian President Vladimir Putin was trying to get Trump elected in the current election cycle after allegedly backing him in 2016 and 2020. Asked for comment, Trump campaign spokesman Stephen Chung responded that Putin endorsed Kamala Harris, a reference to a joking comment the Russian president made this week when he claimed to favor Harris. An official with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI, which is coordinating the U.S. counter-election interference efforts, said U.S. intelligence agencies do not take Putin's public statements as representative of Russia's covert intentions, with examples of where his public statements have not aligned with Russian actions. That includes comments that he would not invade Ukraine made just before invading Ukraine. Israeli troops shot and killed a Turkish-American woman who had been protesting against settlement expansion in the Israeli-occupied West Bank yesterday, according to Palestinian and Turkish officials. The White House said it was deeply disturbed by the death of Ayşenur Ezgi Egi and called on Israel to investigate. Turkey's foreign ministry said she was shot in the head and blamed Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government for her death. Israel's military said its troops had fired toward an instigator who posed a threat by hurling rocks at soldiers. That's the sound of an AR-style rifle illegally modified to shoot fully automatic. 3D printers can be used to modify guns, but the feds are cracking down. And Justice Department officials yesterday announced new initiatives to push back against the proliferation of 3D printed machine gun conversion devices. I spoke with USA Today investigative reporter Nick Penzenstadler for more. Nick, thanks for making the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Nick, what are 3D printed machine gun conversion devices and why are they such a big issue?
Yeah, these things are called Glock switches or chips or machine gun conversion devices, MCDs. And what they do is basically very quickly convert semi automatic rifles and handguns to fire fully automatically. So they're little pieces of plastic or metal that have a big impact.
So, what work is the ATF now doing here around 3D printers? I know you had the chance to go visit the center in West Virginia.
Yeah, really interesting. This big vault and research facility in West Virginia has guns of all shapes, sizes, and varieties, but a whole section of their basement is dedicated to 3D printing frames, receivers, but also these little machine gun conversion devices. So the ATF is testing and trying to stay one step ahead of the newest and latest plans that have been distributed on the internet that people can download and make these devices.
We know the ATF wants to go after the producers of the illegal devices. How important really is it to also collaborate with the 3D printing industry to prevent misuse of these products?
Yeah, we heard the ATF director say, we can't do this alone. They brought in these academics to maybe figure out some technological or algorithmic way to get ahead of people downloading these and maybe block the scripts that can make these. We've had it compared to the color printing industry decades ago, and there was this concern over counterfeit money, and the printing industry actually got involved and tried to help with some solutions to that. So there's been some comparisons to that, and we'll see if the 3D printing industry will help the ATF block these.
Nick, what are we hearing from gun safety groups about these latest ATF efforts?
They're happy with it. We heard from Everytown for gun safety, and they said, they've been raising the alarm for this for a while, and this isn't a new problem, and they're grateful that the ATF is trying to move toward more effective solutions and trying to widen the tent on who's involved in solving it.
Have we heard from the gun companies and, where do they land as part of the problem or solution in all this?
They have been relatively quiet about this problem. There is some pressure on companies like Glock because the Glock handguns are particularly targeted for these, and they have a particular design that makes them relatively easy to modify. But they also make a lot of money on the base of this device, the gun itself. And then if you're 3D printing an entire gun, you still need parts. So we haven't heard a lot about them participating in this effort.
And in terms of what's coming up next here, Nick, I know the Supreme Court is expected to weigh in next month. What can you tell us there and what's next for this conversation moving forward?
Yeah, in early October, we're going to hear oral arguments in this so-called ghost gun kit. And that's a little bit different. That's about these unserialized kits and printing your own frames and guns in your house, and then the proliferation and manufacturing of these. So the Supreme Court's going to weigh in and set some more boundaries on that. But again, it's this tension with people pushing the limits with hobbyists and trying to push right up against the law, and the ATF trying to push back and stop some of that from happening.
All right. Nick Penzenstadler is an investigative reporter with USA Today. Great breakdown as always. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Taylor.
Losing a pet can be devastating. Animals become part of our lives and part of our families. How do we make sense of those feelings and cope when we lose our furry loved ones? Tune in tomorrow morning after 5 a.m. Eastern Time to hear my conversation with Tom Nichols, a staff writer at The Atlantic, best known for his sharp political analysis, who shares the story of his cat Carla, who recently passed. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your pods, and if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, and I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.